I'd like to start today's webinar by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all live and work. For me, that's the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of Canberra and the Canberra region. I acknowledge the deep and long traditional knowledge which exists around climate and Australia's weather, and the importance of this knowledge in combining with Western science to better understand what our future climate could be like. I pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So today's webinar is called Developing and Delivering Improved Climate Change Projections for Australia. Our presenters today are Michael Gross from CSIRO and Rob Coleman from the Bureau of Meteorology. Michael and Rob were lead and deputy chief investigators for the Hub's projects, which focused on climate change projections, the science and the delivery of those projections. Rob will be our first speaker today, so I'll hand over to you, Rob, to begin the presentations. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sonia. So hello, everybody. I'll talk about, for the first 15 minutes or so, about the findings from Project 5.3, the Regional Climate Projection Science and Delivery. And just before I start, I hope you enjoy the picture on the front. We actually agonised a bit over what picture to have up front in our presentation. I put one in, but then Sonia insisted on this photo of Alice Springs in 2090, which I think you'll agree is actually a very nice photo to start with.
Rob, you've just put yourself on mute.
Okay, that's it. No more attempted humour in this. So the outline of this talk, we'll talk about, I guess just before we introduce the topics, I'd say the overall strategy of this project was to really look within the resources we had of this project, of the important questions, and what we saw as the sort of outstanding questions for climate projections and rainfall in Australia, and addressing some of what we saw as some of the biggest uncertainties in those projections. So we sort of wanted to focus on those particular areas. But okay, so I'll talk about climate sensitivity, Northern Australian rainfall, and a case study on one of the 4 case studies we did on Gondwana rainforest. Then Michael will talk about Southern Australian rainfall, downscaling, the value of regional climate modelling, looking at some 6 models, and then talking about some of the communications. So next slide, please, Michael. Okay, so we'll start with equilibrium climate sensitivity, and this is a concept that's been around for a very long time, of course, at least 40 years. And strictly equilibrium climate sensitivity is how much the climate would change, either in a model or the real world, if you were to instantaneously double the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's a fairly idealised quantity, but it turns out it's an extremely important one. And why is it so important? And some of the research that's come out of this NEST project has actually highlighted the critical importance of this number. And what I show there is the equilibrium climate sensitivity is just one of several different measures of climate sensitivity that have been used. For instance, a transient climate change that takes consideration of ocean heat uptake has also been commonly used. What we did in this project, which is led by Michael, but also included a really nice collaboration with some people in the UK Met Office, or the UK rather, that have been major players in this area for many years. And we looked at what it best explains the range of warming that you see across models in the 21st century. What measure of sensitivity best shows that? And when you look at things like equilibrium climate sensitivity, but also transient climate response and other measures, it turns out that the ECS explains the largest amount of spread across models. So it's actually the best single indicator of that spread in models globally. And you can see an R-squared there of 0.9, very high R-squared. And it's also very large in Australia as well, and for the Australian region. This came as quite a surprise, actually, because it doesn't take into consideration transient change, doesn't take into consideration ocean heat uptake. So this has actually made some ripples internationally, and for instance, has motivated things like the Sherwood paper. Next slide, please. Okay, so we know equilibrium climate sensitivity is very important. We also know variability is critically important in the Australian region. And perhaps something not quite so well known is we know we have a very large range of ECS, but we also have an extraordinarily large range of between 4 and 5 of the standard deviation of decadal variability globally, and that also has effect on Australia. So it's also a crucial unknown. We have deep understanding from some of the scientists in our project on interannual and decadal variability. So we asked the question, are there links between the two, between decadal variability and climate change, so equilibrium climate sensitivity? And the first thing you look at is whether the crucial feedbacks that control both are similar. And again, perhaps surprisingly, we found that there are very close links between them. That the sort of feedbacks that operate on interannual and decadal timescales, like water vapor feedback, like cloud feedback and so forth, very similar in strength to those under climate change, and also very closely correlated with them. So with this strong a model for one, there's strong a model for the other. So the question is, can we use that? Can we therefore exploit that to narrow equilibrium climate sensitivity? So next slide, please. So what we did is we looked at, are there correlations between, straight up between variability and climate sensitivity? If there were, it would be actually quite amazing, because there's a lot happening in variability. Obviously, it's quite different. When we looked at CIMMET-5 models, you see on the left there, that actually found a strong and statistically very significant correlation between the two. Suggesting that we could actually, there's a potential there to narrow, constrain equilibrium climate sensitivity with decadal variability. When we looked at CIMMET-6 models, the correlation's still there, but it's weaker. In fact, in CIMMET-3 models, quite old models now, but there was no correlation, no statistical correlation, whether that's caused by the age of the models or whether we're seeing other statistical artifacts or flukes or other processes, we don't know. So the hints of an important relationship, but the process is not fully understood. And other studies elsewhere have found some quite strong statistical links. So this is an area that really needs a bit more exploration. So next slide, please. So the last thing I'm going to talk about on sensitivity and feedbacks is bring it home to access. So model sensitivity then for access is a critical feature of the model. And when we look at the base model, the UK Met Office model, we can go back to studies like Stainforth in 2005. You see there the figure on the left. And they found by changing the physics in the model, things like convective detrainment and so forth, they were able to change their climate sensitivity by an enormous amount, like to 2 to more than 10 degrees, which is quite extraordinary. So we asked the question here, we didn't have the resources to do a full perturbed physics ensemble like this. I'd like to, but we didn't have that capability. So what we did is a much more limited thing, and this was work with Charmaine Franklin and a bunch of other people. We actually asked if we take those physics settings in the model and actually perturb them in the sort of way that typically they are perturbed in a tuning exercise, is that going to be sort of kicking around the climate sensitivity of the model? And if it does, it's a real worry, right? It means that those sort of necessary but largely ad hoc adjustments would be major players in the response of the model to climate forcing, which would be a real concern, really. In fact, what we found was when we changed those things like convective detrainment and warm rain processes, conversion, and so forth, we found very little impact. So in fact, we found that it was actually robust to these choices, which is very reassuring. Okay, next slide, please. So I'll go on now to understand projecting Northern Australian rainfall. And this has been a significant part of this project. So why are we concerned in particular about Northern Australian rainfall? Two reasons really. One, it's an area slated by the government for future development. Right? There's a Northern Australian white paper which said, look, this is a real future development for infrastructure. So obviously a very important region for the other social and environmental impacts that climate change would have there, including for Indigenous populations. But if you look also on the little figure on the right, you see from climate change in Australia, the change, the 90% range of the change in rainfall by 2090 under RCP 8.5, and you see it's plus or minus 20%, and that's dogged the science for decades. Actually, there's been enormous uncertainty in the projection of mean Australian rainfall that just hasn't gone away, and it's not because models, so the average model, the average of all models say it's not much change, but the individual models change a lot. So we address this in this project by some modelling studies, some process understanding, and CMIP6 analysis. So next slide, please, Michael. So this shows the full range of models in all their beauty for CMIP5 and CMIP6. So CMIP5 in green, CMIP6 in yellow, and it shows that sure enough, there's not a clustering of models, there's not a bimodal distribution, they're just like all over the shop. A technique that we've used to try to understand what this spread's all about, what causes it. Next slide, please. Models don't agree. Next one after that, and next one. So what we did, and this was a nice study led by Jo Brown before she left the project, and Sugat Nasay has sort of really taken this up, is to actually cluster the models, what we might call the dry ones on the left there, the ones that simulate future drying, and the wet ones we'd say on the right, which actually simulate greater wetting. Okay, next slide, please. And so when you look at the difference between the two, you find some very interesting things. So this is for CMIP5, and it shows, you see the patterns there of that's the rainfall of dry minus wet, and it's normalized by the warming of the models. So the sort of very sensitive models aren't overrepresented, but in fact, it's not particularly sensitive to that normalization. But actually what you find in CMIP5 is you get this really striking pattern, and it shows that models that dry strongly over northern Australia tend to wet on the equator just west of the date line, and they're very strongly. And so this is sort of a very strong signal that comes out, and unfortunately when you look at that region where they're most wetting, there's a region of significant SST bias in the CMIP5 models. So we have that equatorial cold tunnel too far to the west. We have models many degrees too cold in that region. And so there's a correlation between the rainfall change you get in Australia and the biases in the model, right? So the areas in the model we control. Next slide, please. So when you look at CMIP6, you see something interesting and very different. For a start, actually, we have a much smaller range of precipitation change, which is very good. And secondly, you lose that. There's some similarities in this pattern, right? But it's actually a much weaker pattern and not so sort of tremendously focused on that West Pacific. In fact, the biases are smaller there. But it's saying now, when you now look at what's causing that range, you don't find a correlation with bias. In fact, the correlation you see is, you can see it's much more zonal correlation with sort of dry areas right across the southern hemisphere, South Africa, South America, which we also found in CMIP5, but across the ocean regions as well. And so what that says is that actually it's part of a not just a regional change, but hemispheric change. So in fact, there's a correlation between the SST gradient changes north to south, northern hemisphere versus southern hemisphere, and the Australian monsoon changing. So in fact, this really gives us important new insight into it, saying the drying or wetting that we expect here is part of a much, much bigger picture. And what we then now really need to drill into what's causing those north-south temperature changes. Okay, so next slide. So that's how are we going with time? too late on time here, 45. Okay, we looked at variability and we found not just change is important, but variability. And we would expect variability to increase just because of closest clapeyron. But in fact, interestingly, we see that that sort of variability doesn't increase on daily timescales, but it increases from weekly, monthly, interannual, and decadal timescales. So it shows that there's a lot of variation in the models there, a lot of spread, right? But it does show that there's very strong consistency of increasing variability on all of these timescales. Next slide. So really, I'll probably run out of time. So we've looked at these in more detail in studying what drives the modes of variability. For instance, the intra-seasonal variability, very important because it produces bursts and breaks in the monsoon. And a lot of that's controlled by what's called the Madden-Julian oscillation. Probably most people here know what that's about. Very important oscillation, actually, that models do an extremely poor job of in climate models. So that aside, we find that models that are better at that tend to show a slight increase in the overall rainfall. We've also looked at other issues such as SST patterns and shifts in convection and so forth. I won't have time to talk about that. So next slide, please. So the very last thing I want to just mention is the Gondwana rainforest case studies. So we've done a number of case studies. This is particularly, I think, important and impactful one. We're faced with, in Gondwana, these forests are very small areas, crucially important for biological diversity and so forth. And interestingly, they're cloud forests, so what's important for them is changes in cloud and cloud base height. They get a lot of moisture, especially in stressful, winter conditions there. And there was evidence that the cloud bases were already changing, and this is adversely affecting these regions. Like, this isn't a field we look at very much. Well, what confidence do we have in it? So next slide, please. We went to close collaboration with ecologists, and particularly Melinda Laidlaw, who along with Sugat, really led this project, and thanks go to Mandy Hopkins as well, to connect across these really different disciplines. See if we can quantitatively estimate this thing that we never really looked at before, cloud-based height, and translate into some sort of actionable, practical information. So I won't talk about that. You're welcome to go and have a look at the report and so forth. Next slide. We used downscaling here from NALCLIM and Queensland Futures, and the bottom line is there are uncertainties in it, but unfortunately it looks like those cloud-based heights are going to increase further, which will stress those forests. And last slide is just a couple of publications on that. So I think I've gone over my time. Michael, I'll hand over right to you.
Thanks very much, Rob. And yeah, all of those publications mentioned are all available on the NEST website, so definitely check them out and read more. So I'm going to now talk about the next couple of topics. If I can get my slides changed, here we are. So another big area of focus was what's happening in Southern Australia. So you're probably all aware that Southern Australia has been getting drier in the cool or the wet season, the cooler, wetter months of the year in recent decades, especially in the southwest, but also southeast in recent decades. There's multiple lines of evidence that this decrease is likely to continue in the future and very likely in the southwest, but we can't put a rating of virtually certain or we're 99% sure. And the range of different models is actually still quite broad. So the plots at the right are from the State of the Climate 2020, showing recent changes, recent anomaly of rainfall, and then the trends in the southeast and the southwest. You can see the decrease and the lack of wet years in recent years. The plot at the bottom is projections under a very high emission scenario, ICP 8.5, showing most models showing a decrease. But you can see the top of the range is still up there at 0, showing little change. So the median is -8%, but there could be as much as -26%. But there's also a model showing 4% increase. So can we constrain or put a limit on the range of modelling, and can we rule out a wetter future, or should we plan for likely drying, but possibly little change. That was another big question that we thought was really worth giving some attention to. So we had a couple of studies under this project looking at the key atmospheric circulation features that are relevant to rainfall in Southern Australia, and they're listed on the right there. I won't go through them all, but they're quite technical names, I guess, but they're to do with the upper atmosphere jets, the storm track, blocking, etc. And just to give you a little bit of a view of where they are. So baroclinic instability measured through the Phillips instability criterion. We measured over this kind of region of Australia. We've got the jets, which in wintertime is split into two, the subtropical jet and the polar front jet. The strength and location of those jets are very important to rainfall, especially that one. We've got what we call the storm track. This is the average position and kind of variability in the storminess in the atmosphere over these regions. And we've also got atmospheric blocks or atmospheric blocking, which are also really important for rainfall in Southern Australia. And each and all of these will have an effect on the future of rainfall in Southern Australia. So I won't go through the details of the process we went through, but I'll just give you the conclusion. So both studies using 3 different methods looked at some pretty strong agreement of constraining the rainfall projections to a lower median or lower mean model, and also eliminating the wet end of projections. So the first one there is a bar chart of, first of all models looked at, all models that we had available, the ones that we could fully test, then the ones that passed our criteria and the ones that were rejected. And you can see a slight difference in the range of possibilities in those box plots, including a lower mean, lower median and no wet end. The second study, slightly different presentation, but similar message there, found the same thing. If we reject the kind of 25 lowest scoring, 50 and then 75%, you see a consistent pattern of lowering the median and a drier top end. And in the southwest, that means there's quite striking results of, well, if we reject even just the first 25% that we think are candidates to reject, the median goes from -30 down to -40%. So it makes it an even more extreme rejection in the median there. And southeast, less clear results. But if we only go with the top 25%, quite a marked constraint on the rainfall projections. So it doesn't solve all issues, but it's evidence that perhaps that little change or wet end of the projections is less plausible than the dry cases, unfortunately. Another topic the project covered was looking at regional modelling and downscaling, and what does it get you? This is, of course, another big topic in climate projections because everyone wants to have really regional, localised information, and regional modelling gives you the potential to do that, but it really needs to be examined. We just can't assume that because it has the potential to give you things that it will do all that. So we need to demonstrate what it does and why. So in this project, we looked at the benefits of multi-model approaches. We now have the Cordex ensemble of different models, so we can intercompare different models and what they do. And the project supported, in part, the delivery and evaluation of Cordex, including a couple of key papers by Jason Evans at the University of New South Wales and postdoc Giovanni Di Virgilio, and they were fantastic papers. Also, another study led by Giovanni is the concept of realised added value. And this has been getting a bit of attention internationally and being taken up by others, which is great. And it's a really useful concept, we believe, which is looking at areas where there is added value in the simulation of the current climate. So therefore, it looks a bit better in the current climate, and also it gives you a different projection of climate change. So with what they call potential added value, the signal is different from the host model. And where you've got those two together, we propose there's some good evidence that it's doing something really interesting and important. So the map on the right there shows a map of this index, realised added value, in temperature and rainfall combined. And the redder the colour, the higher the index, or where we believe there's more, the regional modelling is really doing something worth noting. And we get a higher value where you really expect it to do, where there's effective topography or coastlines. So the reddest colours are on the Alps in Tasmania, and also some really interesting cases in North Queensland, where there might be value for simulating things at a finer scale to do with topography or other processes. So this is a really noteworthy output from the project, and yeah, kudos to Giovanni for leading it and the others for contributing as well. There's also a stronger case to that regional modelling is really doing something if we have a physical explanation or storyline behind why you're getting those results, and also if there's consistency with trends in the past that we know are likely to be driven by climate change. So another study that was leveraged through the project was looking at the Alps in particular. So here on the right there is some plots of the projected rainfall change signal from one set of regional climate modelling inset into the broader picture from the global model. And you can see it adds some interesting finer scale detail over the Alps region, including some signals which are kind of quite notable, like that drying in winter, to the bottom right, a darker brown colour on the inland slopes of the Alps compared to the surrounding regions. And we had a look at this particular signal. In winter, this is enhanced drying on the windward slopes of the Alps, and in summer, an increase in convective rainfall on the peaks of the Alps. And it's consistent with the realised added value index. It's consistent with parts trends to quite a degree. It's consistent between different modelling systems. So this is comparing the WRF modelling done through NARCLIM, the Queensland modelling done using CCAM, the VCP19 regional climate modelling done for Victoria, also using CCAM, but different set of runs. It's also consistent with some other similar regions around the world, which kind of is a good indication that there's something kind of consistent going on in this type of setup. And we found that it was consistent with some physical theory that we found from the literature. So this is giving quite a strong case that this regional signal produced by regional climate modelling is really worth noting and taking into account when we start looking at water resources, especially for the Murray Basin, which includes those windward slopes of the Alps. It also really shows the benefits of having multi-model ensembles available, so we can intercompare what's going on in a comparable way, and also collaborating. So there was Victorian, Queensland, New South Wales and Tasmanian state projects collaborating on this study. So moving quickly on to the next thing we wanted to cover as part of this project. Another big topic in climate projections is, of course, each new generation of climate models brings new things and needs to be assessed and looked at. So we used the project to kind of facilitate a large collaborative effort to have a first look at CMIP6 and what it's saying for Australia, with over 20 authors from 9 different affiliations around Australia, and produced this paper, which is proving to be a useful resource as we start to get to grips with CMIP6. And it's already cited more than 20 times in less than a year, which is doing pretty well. And it's just called Insights from CMIP6 for Australia's Future Climate. And just for a little bit of context, there's a timeline of the different CMIP rounds there on the right. And each one has grown in size, each one has grown in complexity, and there's more and more models, there's more and more finer and finer resolution, etc. And it's going to underpin large parts of the IPCC 6th assessment report. So what were some of the results from our first look at CMIP6 and assessment? Well, it really appears that there's improvements in some of these major important model biases, but we would kind of describe those improvements as incremental. It's not a step change, they're just getting better and better. So which is nice, but it's really important to note that not all the issues are solved. A lot of the projections are broadly similar to CMIP5. There's nothing sticking out as a massive game changer, except for one, which I'll get to in a sec. There's a better resolution of some features. So for example, the regional sea level, the dynamic sea level processes involved in regional sea level change are better resolved, which is going to give some new and interesting and important insights about regional sea level change. And also they are done under a new set of shared socioeconomic pathways, the new generation of future scenarios compared to the old ones, RCPs. And this will give us new opportunities to explore the future with a socio-economic dimension as well as a physical climate change point of view. So what was the one game changer? I'm sure you all have guessed. It's climate sensitivity and temperature change. So CMIP6 has got a broader and more uneven range of climate sensitivity than CMIP5 had, including a group of models with very high value and 2 with a very low value. And so this, of course, will need careful handling in the IPCC 6 assessment report. I know there's been a big topic of discussion there, and it'll also have to be very carefully handled in whatever we do in Australia. So national projections, state projections, etc., have to grapple with this issue. And the CMIP6 range in the ECS index that Rob kind of explained is different from what you arrive at when you use multiple lines of evidence to assess a range of ECS. And as an illustration of that, here's a figure from the paper that's been adapted. So this is the temperature projection under a very high SSP 585 emissions pathway using the 20 models that were available then. There's more now, but I just use those 20 for this test case. Including all models, at 2090 is the blue bar. If we restrict that to just the bounded range from the Sherwood review, we get the orange bar. So not a lot of change, but a slightly different mean. If we restrict it to the 95% confidence level, you really reduce that top end, a little bit at the bottom end. And if you restrict it to what they saw as the likely range, you get a really quite constrained range of global temperature change by 2090. So there's going to be people who would advocate for doing that, restricting and rejecting or down weighting certain models that have got a very high or a very low sensitivity value. And I think it already has, and it will continue to be a source of many squabbles and debates and arguments, which is always good. But of course, incredibly important, because what is the plausible top end of projections is a super important topic, of course. So just to kind of mention some of the other achievements of the project was we contributed to a lot of high-level engagements and releases leveraged with other activities. So our project was able to be a big contributor to the State of the Climate 2018 and 2020 reports. 2 authors, that's Jason Evans and myself, was was 2 of the science authors of the science report for the Climate Measurement Standards Initiative, providing information and the start of some guidance for these kind of financial disclosures. And this is a bigger activity than this project, but we were able to contribute to it. And we were involved in some of the briefings to the Council of Financial Regulators and so on to kind of explain and deliver what was in that science report. There's members of the project who are involved in the IPCC 6 assessment report, and what we generated and the knowledge we produced was able to be shared and leveraged with other projects, including the VCP19 projections, the electricity sector climate initiative, work in the Pacific, and others. And we also contribute, as Rob said, to 4 case studies: the Gondwana rainforest one, as mentioned, the greater glider distribution in Queensland, Shark Bay impacts, and mango growing in Northern Territory, and also other hub level activities and case studies. In terms of delivery of projections to users, there's a range of activities led by John Clark. The component of delivery included training of government and cross-sector people, over 100 people. I didn't get the latest stats, so you can ship that into the chat if you like, John, exactly how many people were trained under this project. We maintained the website. The website gets over 2,500 visitors, unique visitors per week. We maintained the data delivery and help desk with, on average, 5 requests per month solved. We contribute to the webinars through Hub Science webinars, State of the Climate webinars, and others. We also contributed to a lot of different meeting, conferences, briefings, advice, etc., and produced brochures and summaries. And there's 2 more that are up on the NEST website. Looking at Southern Australia and looking at using climate projections to 2030, making sure people account for variability and the change signal when they start thinking about that time frame. In terms of the website, climatechangeinaustralia.gov.au remains one of the most notable websites to get climate change information for many stakeholders. And we contributed to an update to these webpages due for release tomorrow, which is very exciting. And this includes some new information, including state and national summaries of information, improved navigation and search. And we contributed a little to this as part of a collaboration with the Hub. And we contributed largely, one thing we contributed on behalf of the project is some new pages looking at global warming levels projections. So just to go a little bit of a rundown of what that means. So rather than saying RCP 4.5 at 2050, there's a lot of focus now on, well, what does 2 degrees of global warming mean? What does 3 degrees of global warming mean? And that means global warming, not local warming. And that means since pre-industrial, not from now. A kind of a shortcut is taken as 1850 to 1900, not truly pre-industrial, but pretty close, and we've got good data for that period. So we presented a series of pages looking at projections of temperature and rainfall at these warming levels, 1.5, 2, 3, and 4. We don't have information on the climate extremes yet. We will hope to add that soon. But also some of the background information you need to understand and interpret those projections, including what warming level we're at now, about 1.1, when we might reach each of these future global warming levels, how much Australia has warmed since that early period, including multiple approaches to try and get at that, considering we don't have good observed data back that far. We also covered topics like climate change emergence and whether we've had any years already equivalent to some of these years. So for example, 2019 average annual temperature for Australia as a whole would be something like an average year in a 1.5 degree world. We also contributed towards building towards future climate projections, including running a workshop called Next Gen Climate Projections for Australia, including a wide collaboration with international guests, stakeholder groups and more. And we agreed on various recommendations to move forward and then provided that as a basis for a activity under the National Council of Climate Science Advisory Committee activity. So just to sum up, I mean, we feel like we were tackling some of the most important issues in providing usable and reliable regional projections of the mean climate. That's temperature and rainfall, including climate sensitivity and how it relates to temperature, rainfall processes, assessing models, including the new models, and what we get from regional climate modelling. We also maintained and delivered projections and supported people to use them. And just on behalf of Robert and I and the whole project, we just wanted to say thanks very much for anyone and everyone who was a project member in either project over all this time and or a collaborator over, we've had many, and so thank you very much to everyone. And a lot of them are listed at the top there of the actual project members, but there's also a lot of other collaborators that we are too numerous to really kind of list, but that's a lot of them there. So including Rob, Ghislaine, Joe, Sugat, Lawson, etc. from the Bureau, and John, Vanessa, Claire, etc. from CSIRO, and Jason and Giovanni from Uni of New South Wales. And some people have moved on, so Aurel is now in Singapore, Joe is now at Uni of Melbourne, and hopefully this project helped them to move on and to bigger and better things. And yeah, and Giovanni's in New South Wales now, so. And yeah, we had a good time working with you, and so thanks very much.